Pages of the Past. Sniper on the Eastern Front. The Memoirs of Sepp Allerberger. Chapter 4. Retreat from Nikopol. A thaw had set in, and we were obliged to force a way through an often knee-high quagmire. Boots and socks were saturated and then weighted down by thick mud. In total exhaustion, our progress forward was mechanical. It was not uncommon to come across a man who had fallen asleep upright in the place where he had come to a standstill. A comrade would take his hand and drag him onwards. Minutes later, he would come fully awake and, in shock, remember nothing. The effort required on this march was so enormous that it virtually defeated the Pervitin tablets. I carried my sniper's rifle slung across my back, the weapon wrapped around by a thick strip of tent cloth to protect it against the mud. My MP40 dangled across my chest. I had developed the habit of chewing dry biscuits to stave off lethargy. I had a store of them for which I traded my cigarette ration. More lay behind the Russian maneuvers than a mere transfer of the weight of their attack strongpoint. Their operation developed into a major offensive which on 30 January 1944 drove a great wedge through the German lines, threatening to double-round two German armies at the Basalyuk estuary on the Great Bend in the Dnieper. As was so often the case, the OKH dallied until it was almost too late before ordering an urgent shortening of the front. Our forces were saved only by the incompetence of the Russian commanders who, at the decisive moment, elected to rest and reorganize away from the critical area rather than mass for the crucial thrust to the Dnieper Bend. More by luck than judgment, therefore, the OKH succeeded in arranging their forces in such a manner that the Russian operation, when it came, ran up against enough resistance to stifle it, and it was to support these positions that we plowed our way through the mire. Wearing soaking winter battle gear, hunger and exhaustion etched in our faces, we fought mechanically, ghosts driven only by the personal desire to survive. There were no pauses in the battle any longer. I fell ill. Constant hypothermia combined with drinking the water found in bomb craters resulted in severe gastroenteritis. During one of his rounds, the battalion commander found me curled up like a wounded animal, trembling in the corner of a shelter. Hauptmann Max Kloss was a dark-haired young officer of slight build who had taken command of the battalion at the Nikopol bridgehead. He had volunteered to transfer to the Russian front from Lapland in the belief that he would be of greater service to the Reich where soldiers were needed most urgently. He was impregnated with National Socialist values which stated that a thing worth doing was worth doing well, and as an outward expression of his belief, he wore the red and white diamond-shaped badge of the Hitler Youth beside the Iron Cross, first class on the left breast pocket of his uniform tunic. On the other pocket he wore the German cross in gold. Yet he was no blindly faithful party follower, but rather a committed and brave soldier. Seeing my pitiful condition, he requested an explanation from my company commander, who was accompanying him. The latter replied that I was a sniper who knew his business.
We need every specialist. We've got to get this man on his feet.
Kloss stated firmly.
He is the last sniper we have left. I cannot afford to lose him.
So saying, he ordered me to report to the battalion command post and associate with the dispatch runners.
Tell them to look after you,
he said, adding, as he turned to the other officer,
I hope you have no objection, Herr Oberleutnant?
The latter shrugged his shoulders. Trembling, I rose and dragged myself off. It was a kilometer, and after a series of toilet stops on the way I arrived at the runner's lodge, a hole excavated into the ground with a roof of logs, threw myself into the sleeping area and groaned.
The commander says you're supposed to look after me. To start off, if you don't mind, I need new trousers. Certainly, Fräulein Allerberger. The professor will be along shortly to powder your tender little arse.
One confirmed, but all the same, they really did look after me, supplying me with tea without milk and an extremely effective diarrhea preventive called Dolentin. This was an antispasmodic analgesic developed by Hoechst in 1939 and used to suppress the pain from wounds. In the early 1940s, Hoechst chemists succeeded in increasing its effectiveness 20-fold, the new drug having the name Polamidon. In 1944, Germany produced around 650 tons of analgesics. Dolentin, bed rest, and proper nutrition restored me to health within a few days. The nursing care lavished on me by the dispatch runners was a tremendous help. The battalion commander visited me occasionally to inquire after my progress, and during our talks it emerged that we saw eye to eye on many things. On the day I regained mobility, albeit still shaky around the knees, Klaus told me,
"It's high time we got you back to work. There are 4 new NCOs coming. I have put them with your company. I was thinking you might show them what you know. My driver will take you."
15 minutes later, I was in a Kubelwagen spluttering down a dirt track to company. We were less than 3 minutes out when the left side front wheel hit a landmine. The steering wheel was knocked from the driver's grasp and the vehicle sheared to the left. I heard a cry of "shit!" and found myself hurtling through the air alongside the driver, the pair of us making a soft landing in the quagmire skirting the track. The Kubelwagen tipped over and came to rest on its side minus a wheel. Neither of us dared move and we remained pressed to the ground. "That shit thing must have been one of ours," the driver said. "Yesterday, it was mine free here, and Ivan hasn't been near the place for days. Are you hurt?" Apart from a few bruises, I had escaped scot-free again. On all fours, feeling our way gingerly forward with our fingertips, we made our way back to the car. While discussing our next move, we saw a column of engineers, Pionnier, approaching. "What are you people doing here?" the corporal cried. "And who gave you permission to set off our carefully laid mines?" Their gentle cynicism failed to mollify us. "You assholes are supposed to tell people where you are putting your mines," the driver retorted. "Well, now you know," came the response. "And if you're rude, we'll just leave you here. I suggest that you 2 gentlemen tag along behind us," the platoon corporal said, leading off smartly. "That Kubelwagen's not going anywhere, so we might as well follow," my driver muttered. The road to company was barriered off, and we were soon back at Battalion HQ to deliver our report. The outcome was that Klaus placed me under his direct command and lodged me with the dispatch runners. The latter shaved every morning, a ritual I had attempted to observe for some time, lived beyond the direct line of fire, wore clean uniforms, and ate regularly, and I considered this a great improvement to living in a trench at company. The Russians threw everything at us in the attempt to achieve their objective. On the battlefield, we wanted to fight by rules, and so avoid all-out mayhem. Our attempts to convince the Soviets met with little success. The Soviets set the ground rules from the beginning and repaid our initial success with barbarity. Particularly incomprehensible, however, was their unspeakable bestiality to civilian populations, not only enemy and neutral, but Russian as well. Despite heavy bombardment, we succeeded in transporting 2 desperately needed batteries from GAR 112 Artillery Regiment into the Nikopol bridgehead by rail. There was an immediate threat of encirclement, and it had been decided to evacuate the seriously wounded. Only 1 locomotive had survived the incoming endeavor undamaged, and it was to return to the west pulling an ambulance train composed of cattle trucks painted with the Red Cross on a white background on the side paneling. That morning, when in a platoon marching to our new positions, our route took us past the loading bay. Hundreds of wounded, many wearing only the scantiest field dressings to cover terrible injuries, lay around the wagons. We were appalled at the numbers of dead and horribly mutilated, Upon seeing us, hope revived in the eyes of the moribund. Many made the same plea. "Hold off, Ivan, until the train has got clear." The words struck a chord in the hearts of one or two riflemen and ignited in them a spark of motivation to do the best they could to comply. In reality, the situation was desperate, for the Soviets had come to within 1,500 meters of the loading bay. Upon leaving the area, we came under fire. Vastly outnumbered, our resistance amounted to little more than a delaying tactic. Meanwhile, the ambulance train had managed to pull away, but the Soviets switched their priority to destroying it by artillery bombardment, and a few minutes later it was strafed and bombed from the air by fighters. The truck carrying the medical personnel received the first direct hit, killing all but 2 of the surgeons. An explosion derailed the train, the trucks piling into each other at crazy angles, spewing out the wounded in all directions. The magnitude of the disaster was such that the few surviving surgeons and medics were utterly overwhelmed. We held the front line ahead until the following morning. The route of our withdrawal brought us once more to the ghastly place. Hanging from the wrecked trucks, limbs in crazy dislocation, were the dead. Arms and legs were strewn across the terrain, their bandages fluttering in the wind. In their panic, most of the wounded had attempted to drag themselves clear on all fours, but the majority lacked strength for the effort. Their wounds had reopened, and they either bled to death, or their circulatory system collapsed. The radius of the killing field, littered with corpses, extended 300 meters from the train wreck. The handful of medics and doctors had done what they could. Hope grew at our approach. A group of 50 German riflemen, half of them in need of proper medical attention themselves. The Russians were hot on our heels and would arrive within the hour. We helped by improvising stretchers and agreed on a cruel selection process, picking out those still able to walk or who had a realistic chance of surviving a stretcher journey. The remainder would be left behind. 24 hours previously, we had to some extent envied the wounded, since at least theoretically they had come through and were now headed for home. But now the war had seized them back, restored them to our ranks, and given them the task of fighting for their lives should they wish to continue living. A pistol shot rang out. Instinctively, all looked towards the report. A Jaeger, 8 in his hand, was standing over the body of one of the wounded. I strode over and asked the man, "What the hell have you done?" With a sob, he sank to his knees, and it was a few minutes before he composed himself enough to reply. I looked at the body of his friend and neighbor, both legs amputated, the stumps ripped apart and bleeding, the upper torso riddled with steel splinters. It was incredible that he had survived so long with such injuries. The man knew he would be left behind to fall into Russian hands. When the two friends met, he had pleaded for a last act of friendship, a bullet to bring his suffering to an end. He implored so passionately that his friend fulfilled his request. This kind of thing was absolutely contrary to regulations. As we trudged away from the grim location, we hoped that the Russians, when they arrived, would care for the wounded, or at least put them swiftly out of their misery. It was an awful lot to expect. Often, they tortured the wounded, and had there been no surgeons present, very possibly we would have performed a kindness for all the living we had to leave behind. I prepared my sniper's rifle and brought up the rear about 500 meters behind the main group. We had been no more than 30 minutes on the march when I became aware of a Russian assault troop not far behind. I concealed myself amongst undergrowth and rested the barrel of my rifle on the thick forked branch of a tree. My field of fire was obstructed by bushes which the Russians used skillfully for cover. Routine, intuition, and the feel for a situation inbred in the born hunter paid off in such situations. At 150 meters, I identified the platoon leader, lined the crosswires of the telescopic sight at his chest, and watched his passage through the dense vegetation. The right moment came. For a second or so, he was exposed between bushes. I squeezed the trigger and saw the impact of the projectile hurtle him backwards into the brush. His platoon was sufficiently astute to recognize the work of a sniper and sprayed out in all directions for cover. I got off 2 more rounds without definite result, although one hit a field flask and kept all of them low for the next half hour, gaining precious time for my retreating group. Once I rejoined them to report my success, a number of riflemen volunteered to protect the rear of our column with me, and to my surprise by evening, we had remained undetected. During the night, our path coincided with that of another Jaeger battalion. This provided us with a formation of respectable numbers, and we soon received a signal ordering us to dig in and stem the Russian advance for as long as possible. A sharpshooter, whom I knew only by repute, was Josef Roth, a Nuremberger of my own age who had volunteered for the Gebirgsjäger and, on his own initiative, practiced with a captured Russian rifle, as I had done, and found employment as a sniper. I sought him out from among the other battalion, and we got on handsomely from the start. The battalion commander knew how important it was to have snipers integrated into the defensive pattern and allowed us a free hand. While the other riflemen dug trenches, Joseph and I carried out a joint reconnaissance of the terrain and then settled down to work out our plan. We agreed that 2 experts working as a pair were better than marksmen operating singly. For 3 days, the weather had been dry, with temperatures slightly above freezing. Towards 8 next morning, a shot whipped into the trench diggers. A private soldier crumpled up, screaming. Like greased lightning, the others all threw themselves to the ground, bar one, who dithered a split second, debating whether he should help his fallen friend. He would never have heard the bullet which entered his skull behind the left ear and exited through the right eye, leaving a hole the size of a fist. Somebody yelled, "Achtung, snipers!" From their sentinel nests, the MG gunners poured streams of fire in the general direction of the presumed sniper, but without apparent effect. Joseph and I were still discussing our arrangements at battalion command when a breathless dispatch runner arrived to blurt out his report of events. The commander looked up. "Well, Jaeger, you know your duty. Solve the problem." At a trot, keeping carefully to cover, we followed the runner to a recently finished stretch of trench where a sergeant elaborated the details. A shallow gallery led from one end of the trench into a skillfully concealed observation post amongst a clump of bushes. From this lookout position, we scrutinized the terrain for all possible sniper hides, but failed to identify a spot even though we were suspicious of one particular region because it matched the angle of fire at the end of which our 2 comrades had been felled. We kept a watch in vain for hours. Joseph said there was no position opposite that looked remotely ideal. At midday, while emptying a fruit tin of excrement over the trench parapet, a 3rd Jaeger fell victim to the Russian marksman. He was somewhat luckier twice over than the other 2, however, for the projectile was deflected from the rim of his steel helmet into his upper arm, where it opened a gaping wound only. Contrary to practice, the Russian had not used an explosive bullet. At that very moment, Joseph and I were observing the enemy front line through binoculars. We both noticed how the tall grass fronting a low undulation parted briefly under the pressure wave of the shot. We had to admire the ingenuity of our opponent in creating such a neat lair. He must have burrowed through the elevation from the back. The question was, did he have enough experience to abandon the position, or would he stay? The latter seemed more likely, since all 3 of our victims had been hit from roughly the same direction. We had to get him to show himself, and decided on the use of a lure. Joseph would take up a position about 50 meters along the trench while I remained in the observation post. We would aim and fire simultaneously at the spot where the grass moved. A scarecrow dressed in camouflage jacket and peaked field cap was prepared, and, while sneaking to his position, Joseph handed the scarecrow to a rifleman, halfway along with the instruction that in exactly 10 minutes' time, It was to be raised cautiously until the field cap was visible above the parapet. Our 2 rifles were focused on the presumed hide of the Russian sniper, waiting for the Scarecrow to make his debut. When it rose, the Soviet made his fatal error. He was overconfident, and that was what killed him. Clearly, he had already dismissed from his mind the idea of a lure, and was therefore not even certain of his target when he fired from an unchanged position. Hardly had his shot rung out than we replied, each using one of our precious captured explosive rounds. I watched the drama through the sight. A flurry of hectic activity, and then something heavy being dragged away. A Soviet observer offered himself for death by standing up and surveying our lines through binoculars. Both bullets drilled into his head simultaneously, exploding it like an overripe pumpkin. His binoculars dropped to his chest, undamaged. Now it was the turn of the Russians to cower in their dugouts, enabling our diggers to resume their excavations. Branching forward from our front line at various distances along its length were shallow communication trenches leading to a pair of EMG nests. Joseph and I designed and dug 6 well-camouflaged hides, 3 each, the most forward locations being situated between each MG position. This allowed us to cover no man's land in such a way that no area was obscured from our field of fire. Our plan was to keep up a lethal crossfire until the advancing Russian infantry was at 100 meters, then change to shooting directly ahead. Further down, each branch were 2 more rearward positions for the contingency that we were spotted. This strategy worked and was a major contributory factor towards the success of our battalion in holding off the Russian attack for 2 days, during which time we evacuated our wounded, including the survivors from the ambulance train. The pressure on the Nikopol bridgehead was soon irresistible, and a new encirclement began to threaten. The merged battalions were parted in the general reorganization. Joseph and I shook hands and expressed the hope that we would meet in the future under happier circumstances. Our cooperation had proved that having a specialist observer alongside could be a decisive factor. Although after the death of Baldwin Moser I had vowed to work alone, I saw that teamwork had definite advantages, a fact of which I managed to convince my company commander to the extent that he assented to my recruiting a veteran helper whenever I considered the opportunity favorable. Our 2 regiments began their bitter struggle to escape the Russian encircling maneuver. GJR 144 was assigned the role of mounting diversionary raids aimed at keeping open important crossroads to be used by our retreating forces. Our numbers severely reduced, it was close to miraculous that we kept the line intact, and even launched the odd counterattack to give a deceptive impression of our strength. We suffered grievous losses, and the continued existence of our weakened regiment was never guaranteed, for whole companies were wiped out to the last man. On 12th of February 1944, after 4 days of bitter fighting, the order came down to evacuate the Nikopol bridgehead. By now, our regiment had been so long without supplies that we lacked heavy infantry weapons altogether, and every rifleman had a maximum of 10 rounds. Since we were under continuous pressure from the enemy, the situation was extremely grave, and the few snipers were called upon to serve the role of the artillery. We were the last desperate line of defense, the last hope of holding the Soviets at a distance, and every man went to work gathering together all available Russian rifle ammunition. 3rd Guards Division fought out of the encirclement after great effort and with heavy losses, and reached the new front line at Ingules. We were assisted by severe winter weather, ice and snowstorms, which made organized fighting impossible, but did nothing to alleviate our weakened state. In apathy, we staggered across the flat steppe, ice crystals adhering to pinched features like needles. The Celsius thermometer read 50 below zero. Whoever stopped moving or fell in exhaustion had deadly frostbite within minutes. The hobnailed soles of our mountain boots were a conduit for the cold. If one had sweaty socks, often the skin would freeze to the boot, and then the wearer could only creep forward. The medics could do nothing to help because all liquid medications were frozen in their containers, although for the worst cases they always kept some morphine ampules available in their mouths. Wounds froze at once and became gangrenous. Fights broke out for possession of winter clothing found on stiff, frozen Russian corpses. Happy the man who emerged wealthier by a snow hat or fur boots. Remorselessly, the battalion pressed on. On occasion, when I stopped for a breather, I received encouragement to proceed by a kick in the rear or a prod with a rifle butt, and when necessary, I repaid the compliment. Many of our number died of the cold or total exhaustion, reducing ever lower our number of fighting fit. We dragged the wounded along with us, so long as any individual retained a prospect of recovery. Otherwise, they were abandoned, together with the mules that could go no further, having long since consumed the last of their oats. Our ice-coated weapons were useless. The extreme cold contracted the steel to jam the breeches. The expensive precision work, which was the hallmark of the German weapons manufacturer, was now a curse. Russian weapons with their much greater tolerances functioned even in the lowest temperatures. Trench digging in the stone-hard ground was out of the question. Driven on by the instinct to survive, we dragged our way through the pitiless steppe as the snowstorm grew in intensity. Numb from hunger and exhaustion, I staggered through the knee-high snow, my sniper's rifle slung across my back and wrapped in a thick blanket for protection. Over my uniform, I wore a padded camouflage jacket, the large hood covering my head and face. After a while, there emerged through the impenetrable grayness of the storm the silhouette of a gutted farmhouse with a giant haystack alongside it. By now, the cold was almost intolerable. As I turned towards it, the ground gave way. With a cry, I fell into an infantry trench. One of the occupants was still present, stiff as a board, a smile frozen across his features. Like a wild beetle, I scrambled on all fours to the surface. The farmhouse was only 30 meters distant. Suddenly, movement was seen from within it, and we spread out quickly. My limbs were so cold that I could not unburden myself of the rifle. Various gyrations proved unsuccessful. We were defenseless. Scraps of Russian conversation were borne to us on the wind. Fearfully, we awaited the bursts of MG fire that would spell our doom. Nothing happened. Minutes of terrible uncertainty ticked by until it was obvious. The Russians were snowbound and unable to fight. Both sides withdrew gingerly. Night came, and the storm grew fiercer. Getting under cover now meant the difference between life and death. We slunk towards the giant haystack, the only protection far and wide against the rage of nature. We had reached the point where nobody cared anymore. Shelter was all that mattered. We ran the last few meters and burrowed deeply into the warming straw. Abandoning all rules of self-protection and security, we huddled together like piglets, and so survived. During the 2 days and nights when it raged with unrestrained fury, we suspended hostilities, for the haystack was the only chance of survival for the Russians as well. Unable to fight, the respective bitter enemies agreed to share the stack, separated by a central demarcation line. The storm abated on the morning of the 20th of February 1944, by which time our weapons were again serviceable. Nervously, we reconnoitered the giant haystack, feeling cautiously for the Russians. They had decided that discretion was the better part of valor and vanished into the night. A 3-man patrol, waist-high in snow, inspected the farmhouse for signs of life. They came back relieved. We had the farm to ourselves. Shortly afterwards, we resumed our trudge across the endless, deathly still desert of snow towards the new strongpoint at Ingulez. We had not eaten for days and were close to collapse, when we stumbled into a ruined village held by our troops from whom our regiment obtained ammunition, clothing, blankets, and food. As I was attached to battalion staff, I wallowed in the luxury of superior accommodation, insofar as there was such a thing, equipped with an oven. I was dozing in a cozy corner when Hauptmann Klaus returned from a regimental briefing. Trembling with cold, he crouched before the roaring fire of the stove, then thrust his soaked boots close to the warmth. A pleasant feeling of relaxation must have crept over him, for he slumped back against the wall and was soon asleep. A short while later, when I happened to glance in his direction, I noticed smoke rising from his boots. Within a few moments, he jumped up with a cry of, "Shit, that's hot!" and began to hop around the room. His efforts to pull off the boots, though assisted by a runner, were unsuccessful. The wet leather had dried too quickly in the heat, and, shrinking, had molded to his feet. The only remedy was for Klaus to sit with the boots immersed in a bucket of cold water and wait for the leather to soften and expand. To wide grins from a large assembly, the crisis was eventually overcome. Later that day, a new uniform issue was announced, and Klaus was able to exchange his leather boots for a fur-lined pair. On 25th of February 1944, the Russians attacked but were repulsed by the defensive barrage of a newly operational mountain artillery regiment. Meanwhile, the infantry fell back on Ingulez, where the new front line had been established. As so often in the past, it had been bungled. While officers on the spot had planned correctly for the strategic and tactical situation, OKH intervened to order the holding of utterly superfluous positions at all costs. The result was more heavy losses in men and materials, neither of which were now capable of being made good, for logistically it was no longer possible to compensate the huge drain on resources on this front, even though the lines of communication were regularly shrinking in length. The military operation degenerated into a chaotic struggle to retreat, in which the watchword was "Sauve qui peut." The line at Ingulez was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Requests to shorten the line were refused. The essential reorganization of forces waved brusquely aside. An overstretched and ragged front line awaited Russian attacks, which were ever more gigantic. Divisions and regiments with high morale and extensive experience, such as 3rd General Division, carried the hopes of local commanders. Repeatedly thrown into the thick of the fray, on their shoulders alone often rested the responsibility of preventing a major breach of the line and the specter of encirclement. They had no operational security, for whatever lay to the rear was improvised. The price was insufferable losses in men and materials.